everybody, welcome. And I'm just going to, what I'm going to be doing today is just sharing a little bit about the process that I went to decolonize my literature classroom. And this is one specific class. And just to reassure you, this is not something that came about all at once. I did different pieces in different stages, and I'll just tell, and I'm still working on it. So it's a process, and always looking for more ideas. So I'm hoping you'd be, willing to share any insights or ideas you might have to continue with this process. And I'm currently adapting versions of this for all of my classes, but I started with my post-colonial literature class because it made the most sense given the content and the discussion of sort of imperialism and authoritarianism and its effects on a global scale, to change my classroom practices to make it more student-centered, student-run. So pretty much everything in this course is done in collaboration with the students. And so, whoops, why is it not? Okay, so I'm gonna start, I'm just gonna basically cover what we do in the first 2 weeks to create the syllabus and the calendar together. So the first thing I do on week 1, day 1 with my students is share a list of novels. Post-colonial novels are written by tri-continental authors. And then I use a Google Doc, and I'll show you here. I have to stop and then reshare. Okay, so this is the document that I share with students, and it's just a list. It's organized by different cultures, and it's a list of novels that we could consider. And then I welcome students to add their own suggestions. They can add a novel and their own description. The only criteria is that the novels be written by somebody who's lived most of their lives and written in one of the tri-continental countries, so any country in Asia, Africa, South or Central America, and the Caribbean. And so, or the islands. So you can kind of get an idea of the list, and the list is always changing and students consistently add. So this was the one we did last in this spring. So you can kind of see how that works, and they get to read the descriptions, and then they have a week to vote for the top 4, their 4 choices. And I encourage them to choose novels from different cultures, if possible, and as part of a discussion board on Canvas, they explain their 4 choices, why they're choosing them. So they do some, rationale for that. And this is how we establish our reading. And then also, so I introduced them to this on the first day, and the link is in our Canvas site so that they can comment on the Google Doc. And then the next thing we work on is developing course agreements. So how the students want the class discussion to run. And this can work online for Zoom discussions, online discussions. So when we moved online, we adapted it for our online environment. But basically, students are asked to reflect on the behaviors they most value in class discussion and class participation, what would make the class most meaningful for them. And so you can see the first one is practice deep listening. And one of the things I found out in this class, or this particular group, students said that often in class discussion, a student will comment following another student's comment, and instead of responding to that other student, it's almost like they're just making a separate contribution, and then it becomes like a series of separate contributions. And this class really wanted it to be a dialogue between the students. And so that was the first thing that they put on our class discussion agreements, was to have real dialogue, to really listen to what other people were saying, and then respond to that with your comment. And so, hold on, stop that share. Okay. And so that's what we do on the first day. We worked on the agreements in class, and then their homework for the whole week, following week, will be to choose the readings. And then on day 2, I put up a Google Doc with the course goals, and Wait, are you able to see that? I just want to make sure.
I was just about to speak up. I think we are
Are you
not
not
seeing this.
seeing? Oh, sorry about that.
We are looking at the Google Docs and perfect.
Are you back on the PowerPoint?
Correct.
Okay. Okay, so we're on the PowerPoint. So this is, so yeah, week 1, day 2, we start working on the course goals, and these are the course goals from our course outline, developed by the department and approved by the college. And so we work as a group, interpreting the goals on the Google Doc. So people comment and say, this is what I think this goal is after. This is how I'm interpreting this goal. And then our next series of questions is then, okay, so if these are the goals and this is how we're interpreting them, how do we measure when we've achieved them, right? So how do we determine what it means to achieve these goals? And then that work translates into the development of grading rubrics that the students develop with me, in terms of their weekly discussions, the Canvas discussions, and the final essay that's due at the end of the semester. So we work on these grading rubrics. This is the one from last semester. This is what students decided, given the course goals, would be the most important work for them to do in that final essay. And then we do the same thing for the Canvas discussions. All right, so then on week 2, day 1, so they've now had a week, they've all voted. The discussion posts with their votes are due on Monday. And then Monday night, I tally them all up and come to class with the list of the top choices. And then in class, we discuss any ties. So I've done this now with 2 semesters where I moved to having students choose the readings. And both semesters we had ties. And we break the ties by, usually students decide, usually by culture. So if there's a tie, but there's that one of those novels already has that culture represented in another novel that made it, then we choose the other novel, right? So it's that we get as much breadth in terms of cultures as possible. And the next way, or next thing that we use to break the tie is sometimes gender. So trying to get a representation of different genders in our writers. So if it seems, 3 of our books are written by male writers and there's a tie between a male and a female writer, then we'll pick the female writer, right? Or a gender nonconforming writer, to try to get some broader representation. And so once we've decided on the 4 novels, we can go ahead and start developing our calendar, right? And so in that class, day 1, we start talking about the context presentations for each novel. So each novel has a group of students that presents on the cultural context, references, anything that would help the whole class better understand that novel and where it's coming from. And so they work on that in groups. And so on this day, day 1 of week 2, they sign up for context presentations. And we put together that whole schedule, and then we work on context presentation rubrics. So they actually, what's it called? They evaluate their peers' context presentations. So the students are all the ones doing the evaluation. And this is the one that they chose from last semester. And again, this is tied to the course goals. We go back to the course goals and then we're like, well, what do we really value or what do we want to measure in these context presentations? How do we want to weigh that? And then students use this, when we were doing it in class, they would do it in class I would bring in paper copies and they would fill them out anonymously. They score them, they provide feedback to the group. The feedback was always very supportive and constructive and positive. Sometimes their scores were a little harsh. They tend to have very high expectations of themselves and one another in this class. And so sometimes I would, once I calculated the grade averages based on all of these rubrics, sometimes I would actually raise the grade a little bit because I thought it seemed a little low for the quality of the presentation and the amount of work that went into it. So that's how we do that. And then on week 2, day 2, we fill out the rest of our schedule, which is the supplementary readings that we do for each novel. And I put this example on here because I think it really illustrates the kind of collaboration that I have with students on this whole process. So one of the novels they chose last semester was Carmen Bullosa's Before. And that novel goes very deeply into sort of the effects of masculinity or on masculinity and femininity of Catholic Mexican culture, right? Mexican Catholic post-colonial culture. And so I suggested that students read Hijos de la Malinche by Octavio Paz in Labyrinth of Solitude. And I told them a little bit about that essay and what that essay is doing with the Virgen de Guadalupe figure versus Malinche, the indigenous like betrayer figure. And then I talked to him about some feminist critiques of that and indigenous critiques of what he'd said in that piece. And then one of my students asked me if I had ever read Guadalupe's Sex Goddess by Sandra Cisneros. And it's in this collection, Goddess of the Americas, which I had never read. And so she shared that with the class. And then we all decided, yes, we definitely want to read that piece. And so that became part of the supplementary reading that we read before we went into Carmen Bullosa's novel Before. So you can see how this whole process, and in the space of 2 weeks, we managed to put the whole thing together. And then finally, this is an example of the schedule. So this is the schedule that we came up with last semester. And you can see on week 10, we still hadn't decided the post-colonial feminism readings. We knew we wanted to do something with post-colonial feminism to prepare us for Hosseini's A Thousand Splendid Suns. And to give us maybe some alternative perspectives on these cultures and patriarchy and feminism. And so we ended up deciding on Fatima Mernissi, a piece by Fatima Mernissi and a piece by Chandra Mohanty. But that we hadn't decided that yet, so that one was still TBA. So once we have this whole schedule worked out by the end of the second week, then I populate our Canvas site with all of the materials, and each one of these bolded sections is a module on my Canvas site. And it has the readings if they're supplementary readings. And also by the end of week 2, students are already purchasing the novels so that they can have the novels in time to start on week 5. And then you can also see how I build buffer periods in between the novels. And this is in the template. So we knew that we're going to have a couple weeks or a week between each novel, so students have the time to read it, but also the context presentation groups have time to start preparing their context presentations. So that's basically what we do, and I wanted to make sure we had lots of time for questions. And so either if you want to use the chat or just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask questions.
My first question is, what level are these students? This looks like a pretty sophisticated bunch of students. Are they all senior English majors?
So they are, no, so this is, I teach at a community college.
Okay.
So these are often first semester college students even. I get quite a few people who take the course in their first semester. Well, it's second semester because it's the spring for most of them. But no, they are beginning college students. It is an elective, so people choose to take this class to fulfill a requirement. It fulfills 3 requirements for English majors, so it's a lot of students choose it for that reason, or because they're already curious. I do get a lot of students who are interested in global cultures and world literature, and so there is that investment, but for the most part, you know, that's sort of my role is to give them the exposure, right? In the descriptions of the novels, many students in the class have never read, you know, anything about post-colonialism. And so they're coming in often with no background. And so part of my work in those first 2 weeks is to kind of build their background or expose them to lots of options and help them choose. The other thing I didn't mention, it was on my PowerPoint, but while we're in the first two or the second week, once they voted and read through all the descriptions, their homework is reading Robert Young's Post-Colonialism, A Very Short Introduction. And so they're being introduced to key concepts and writers. A lot of supplementary or potential supplementary reading comes out of that book, right? Because he refers to so many sources. And so they'll say, this piece, like once they picked Spivak, right? He talked about Spivak in there, and that's a very difficult piece, right? Can the Subaltern Speak? And so they chose that because they said it sounded really interesting. And so I said, all right, well, we're gonna do it. It's difficult, and we'll just parse through it together. And so we did, and kind of struggled through some of the opaque pieces, and then the parts that were more accessible, really focused on those, and tried to pull whatever takeaways that we could pull from that. And there's no consequence for not fully understanding the piece, right? It's just how much can we get out of this thing? So they were really motivated. This is also an honors class. It's listed as
honors. I was gonna say that's some pretty high level stuff.
Mm-hmm. So they're honors students. They're UC bound, or most of them are planning to go to our UC system, which is pretty rigorous. And so so they have a lot of motivation to learn as much as they can.
Will you post that list of the students' sort of expected behaviors in class? I skimmed a little bit of it. It looked really pretty wonderful.
It is, and that was all. And then, so what I do each semester is I use that last semester's examples, and I just put that up on Google Docs, and I was like, this is what they picked last semester. And students are like, oh, let's get rid of that one. We don't want to, or can we add this other thing? I've had students who wanted to have cell phone policies on there. The class, is really collaborative and casual, so I'm usually not the one suggesting this stuff, but it comes from them. So it's really interesting, like what different groups will decide to value. And then the discussions that they have about their past experiences in education, what really bothered them in class when other students were doing these things, right? And how do we keep from making that space a negative space, right? So yeah, it's really cool. And I think they're gonna share the PowerPoint, right, Richard?
Yes, we're working with the production team to share out the resources related to the session. In addition, the session is being recorded, and we'll be sending out video of the session. And I want to, we're getting a lot of really great questions in the chat. And so I want to make sure we address some of them. Thank you folks for asking such terrific questions. I'm noticing one of the first I see is from Jan, asking if you could share any memorable examples from the student presentations, which is such a lovely question. Thank you, Jan.
Yeah, do you mean like share like an actual example presentation, or do you want me just to talk a little bit about some of the things that they do?
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with all of the titles. So I'd like you to just pick something that you're thinking right now, wow, this is really memorable, or something that you weren't expecting, something when you saw a presentation, it's like, wow, just tell us a little bit about the book and what happened. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was before I had completely transitioned to this very student-run version of the class. But a couple semesters ago, I had students, they had chosen the book Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. And so there was a group presenting on Things Fall Apart. And this was one of the highlights, because they actually researched the kola nut ceremony and got their hands on a kola nut and brought it into class. So I don't know if you've read that novel, but this is sort of like it's one of the traditions in the Igbo culture, is that whenever you have to discuss serious business with like an opposing tribe member or whatever, you first divvy up the kola nut, which is like, has a kind of a caffeine, it's a stimulant, and everybody takes a little piece of that and chews on it before you actually start talking about business, right? So it's this way of easing into discussion. And so they started their context presentation by chopping up and distributing little pieces of kola nut to everybody in the class. And so that was particularly memorable, where, they'll choose to do things like that to try to, one of the goals of these context presentations is to try to solidify as much as possible these cultural differences, what they might be like, where they're coming from, what the histories are behind them, any references that the novels make that are opaque to us, to try to make those clear, right? So that was one example.
That is such a great example. I'm seeing, welcome Mark, good to have you. I'm seeing a question from Mark. To what extent does the class, to what extent do the students remain a part of the conversation throughout the semester? We talked a lot about the early weeks, but do they kind of continue to be involved in decisions surrounding the course design throughout?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's because that they've decided, right, all of this stuff, there is a lot of buy-in, you know, but they'll be very sort of actively saying, oh, you know, I wish we hadn't chose this one, or I'm really, you know, that their input basically comes out throughout the semester. Sometimes we'll change things in the middle, like one of the supplementary readings is seeming less appropriate, or something comes up in discussion from the previous segment and we really want to read that thing instead, so we'll just move something out and replace it with this other reading. So it's very flexible all semester in terms of like where the students want it to go. They do peer feedback on their drafts of their essays, right? So they collaborate with one another when they're working on that final essay. They give input on the discussion posts and how those are going, and if there are certain things that we could try as a class to better prepare students to write on those novels in those discussion posts. So we, you know, if they need help working with quoting, right, or integrating quotations or things like that, we'll add that to the criteria for the discussion post. So everyone's kind of motivated to practice those skills before they go to write their final paper. Yeah, so it's very flexible, and students give input and change things as we go. When the groups lead the context presentation, they facilitate discussion that day. So they they have to ask facilitation questions, right? And they field questions from their peers. And then once that happens, the next 3 or 4 days that we spend discussing that novel is also just extremely collaborative. We do some small group work where students will work on different questions or different themes in the class. And yeah, so it's pretty student-centered throughout.
I'm seeing a question from Anna. Do students work together to build a rubric to evaluate their group members that worked with them on the presentation? So I think you've mentioned that there's an element of evaluating the other groups. Is there also an element of evaluating within a group, I believe, if I'm understanding the question correctly?
Yes, yes, absolutely. So I do have a separate little survey that goes out. It's an anonymous survey to the group, and then the group members weigh in on how sort of equally their fellow participants participated. Yeah, and we've had issues like everybody does with collaborative work, where you have one group member who will just kind of drop off, right? And things like that happen. The way I've handled that is if somebody stops participating, they have the option to join another group if there are still other groups to join. And if not, they can make that up by doing a separate presentation. And so there are always options for people who may, you know, in a community college, I deal with a lot of students with life issues. So I try to make sure there are just always more options for ways for, you know, for students to participate if something happens and they can't fulfill this obligation, right? That there's an alternative for them as much as possible.
Absolutely. A question from Payman. How many books are students expected to read in one semester, and how do those books all relate to each other? So how do you kind of try to build connections among the novels that are chosen by the students?
So we always choose 4 novels. So there are 4 novels plus those supplementary readings in between them that we decide on. Yeah, so basically, students pick the novels that they are most interested in as a class, right? They sort of vote on this. And then based on that I'll suggest particular ways of ordering them. So this last semester, they ended up choosing Yu Hua's To Live, a Chinese novel. They chose Carmen Buyoso's Before, Thousand Splendid Suns, and Tsitsi Dangaremga's Nervous Conditions. That's why I put these here. So these were their choices for that semester. And so then we start thinking, well, how do we want this to be ordered? And we decided to order from like anti-colonial or anti-imperialist to the most, most directly dealing with imperialism, which was Nervous Conditions. And that was kind of the order that we decided on. So we were gonna start with the Chinese novel as an example of a culture that had been heavily influenced by imperialism and imperialist attempts, but took a different path, right? And then from there, we went to more directly imperialist cultures for the remaining novels. As kind of, so to have some basis for comparison, basically, on how these cultures were affected by imperialism. So yeah, I mean, and sometimes the connections are much clearer. I mean, it was interesting, all of these novels talked a lot about gender and the effects of imperialism on gender roles and gender relationships. And so that worked very nicely too, in terms of some of the overlap that was happening over the course of the novels. They also focused heavily on education. So that was a theme that kept recurring throughout the novel. And then of course, economics, right? The economic effects of imperialism was another major theme that ran through all of them, in class, right? Sort of class distinctions within these imperialist cultures. Or post-colonial cultures. So yeah, I mean, we kind of do the best we can to make a logical order, and then we just start building on key themes and how each novel treats those themes as we go.
So this is another decision that you're incorporating the students. They're helping you decide and kind of thinking through thematically what makes the most sense.
Yeah, and so we have these discussions about, what would we want to start with? Yeah, and the other reason we ended up going with Yu Hua is we had two students who had already read it, who wanted to do that context presentation. And so that took a little bit of pressure off. So we decided that one should be first, right? So that would give the other groups more time to prepare, because we had some folks who were already, ready to go with that one. So, I mean, things like logistics will weigh in terms of how we decide what we should do first. In terms of like the length of the novel. Hosseini's novel was longer, so we wanted to build a kind of bigger buffer between that novel. So we had to put it in a spot in the semester where we would have a couple of weeks there. So we used spring break. So we had spring break, and then we had a couple weeks of supplementary reading, which gave them 3 full weeks then to read that novel. Yeah, so we try to strategize as much as we can.
It's so awesome that even those kind of structural decisions, the students are involved in really empowering them. Anna, first of all, apologizes for asking so many questions. Do not apologize. Continue to keep the questions coming through the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and engage with the discussion that way, that's perfectly fine. But Anna asks, how much time do you spend outside of the class reviewing the novels and supplementary readings in order to kind of properly prepare yourself to facilitate the discussions?
Yeah, so because, now I've been teaching this course for almost 10 years. I teach it once a year, although we moved to like an every other year model because we had another honors English class that we alternate. So I've taught it for 10 years, and over the course of those 10 years, I've, and all the input from students in those years at various levels, right? I've built an archive, and those Google Docs represents that archive. I have a similar, it's on Canvas, it's not on Google Docs, but I have a list of supplementary readings, essays, all on PDF that I just put on Canvas for people to browse through, with post-colonial theory, with cultural, supplementary cultural readings, history, those kinds of things. And so over the years, I've kind of amassed this archive that I share with students. So then it just becomes a question of them reviewing this stuff and saying, this looks interesting, right? Like I want to read Watiango's Decolonizing the Mind, and this is why I want to read that, you know, and what novel would that go well with? Where would we put it? That kind of thing. So, and it's ongoing, and students contribute heavily every semester. So I have a bigger archive every year. You know, like the example that I gave you of the Goddesses of the Americas anthology, right? So that added another source to our archive that wasn't there before this last semester. So anytime somebody suggests something, I'll, you know, review it, add it. So then for me, it's kind of in place now where, you know, it really does, I don't have to do a lot of prep. It's all of the work is during the semester, and then just guiding them, supporting them, you know, trying to help them with logistics, letting them know, oh, this is a really difficult reading. You might not, we might just want to do just that reading for the supplementary because it's going to take us so long to work through it. You don't want to throw, you know, do 2 or 3 readings with Spivak, right? We're going to have to do a lot of work on that one. And so I'll advise them that way as best I can.
Awesome. Folks, continue to feel free to ask follow-up questions. I actually have a bit of a follow-up question as someone who is teaching literature and making these reading list decisions. I'm kind of curious, you mentioned it briefly in passing a moment ago, but you, I imagine, have to review the submissions, the new submissions from students. And I'm kind of curious your criteria. You know, have you ever had to kind of reject something that a student is submitting? And if so, what's kind of your, what are you looking for? What do you tell them in terms of why we wouldn't make this an option?
Yeah, I mean, the 2 reasons I've had to reject suggestions are because at least for the novels, and there's, we can kind of, we have more flexibility with the supplementary readings and the theory, but I want the novels as much as possible to be the writings of post-colonial identities actually living and working in those countries as much as possible, right? And so, and there, you know, there's room for negotiation. Hosseini, we discussed, right? Because Hosseini has spent a lot of his life outside of Afghanistan and left as a young, you know, an adolescent, right? But returned. And so it was complicated, right? In that case, he's much more Americanized than our other authors. Carmen Buyosa was living in New York City for a while. So we have to just have these discussions, right? Does this, is this, you know, representative, or has it been westernized too much then to make it really valuable for these, you know, trying to get these alternative perspectives. Yeah, so one rejected outright was a student suggested one semester that we read Heart of Darkness, which was very valuable, right, in its own right as a, you know, as part of a post-colonial class, certainly, but didn't meet the criteria, right, of a post-colonial writer. And we really want to focus on the voices of, you know, from the cultures themselves as much as possible. Yeah, so I have had to, and then I just give that rationale, but for the most part, the things they suggest fit within those parameters. So it's rare.
Thank you for that. Another question, can you speak to the benefit of context presentations after students have finished the novel as opposed to before or woven into the reading?
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so I didn't really explain this, but so the day that the context presentations take place, like when the students present, it's always the first day that we're going to start discussing the novel, and it's also the day after the discussion posts have been due for that novel. So the assumption is that everyone in the class will have read the novel by the time we all go into that class to hear and respond to the context presentation. And one of the reasons that I wanted to do that is because I wanted to leave the discussion space as a spot for people to just kind of go in cold, right, into these novels and identify the things that stand out for them and how they're responding before they get that additional context. I could see it being beneficial to do it before they start reading. It's difficult logistically, right? Because they'd be getting the context presentation at least, preferably like 2 weeks before that novel would be due. So would things stay in their memory as much, right? By the time we go to actually discuss the novel, I feel like a lot of the context might be lost. So there's that as well. So this felt like a good balance between giving students kind of an open-ended way to explore the novels on their own, and then come together as a group with the context and start doing a deeper dive. I hope that makes sense. I'm totally open to alternatives, though. If like you think that the context presentation might work better in a different spot, I'd certainly be willing to try it or run it by students and see what they think.
Awesome. Another question coming in, actually 2 questions from Payman. Do you reject titles based on controversial authors, such as the Motorcycle Diaries? And then a secondary question, do students get to give feedback on each other's writing prior to the presentation? So is there any element of workshopping prior? As a reminder, the first question, any controversial authors that you reject?
No, I've never rejected an author because they're considered controversial. On the contrary, right? A lot of the students themselves will bring in readings. I had a student who identified as an anarchist. And so this particular student last semester was bringing in very radical material. And then we we discuss anything, right? And because we have those classroom conduct rules that we've established, discussions tend to be really productive, even when there's a wide range of ideologies and views, right, in the class. It tends to be very civil and very, a lot of critical thinking on all sides. So it's been pretty productive, and I would never reject something because it's controversial. And I also tell students, this is college, right? Some of these novels will have very explicit sexual content, language, all sorts of things. But this is part of what it's like to be in a college classroom, is to be able to negotiate these things, right? And they, for the most part, I think they appreciate that. It makes them feel mature, right? And part of something very different from what they were doing in high school. And the next part of the question was
whether students give feedback before the presentations as well.
No, so the groups just work together on their own. They'll invite me in sometimes for help or suggestions, so I'll work with them. And then this was interesting. When we moved online because of COVID, what we were doing was the presenters would present in a Zoom meeting, and I would record that Zoom meeting and then share that recording with the class, and then everybody would give their feedback in whatever way they could if they weren't able to be present, because I have a lot of students with access issues too, who have spotty Wi-Fi, right? So it's easier for them to watch the recording on their phone or something like that. And so they would get the feedback after the presentation from the other students. They do work together. They give feedback at different stages of writing the formal essay. So students do get feedback on that assignment, but for the presentation, the group's kind of in charge of that. They negotiate those things together, they present, and then their peers give them feedback and scores based on what they see, so.
Awesome. Another question about kind of the selection process. Eitan writes, some of the novels written by writers from the diverse backgrounds you've mentioned do cover colonial issues. So he asks, how does the subject matter of the novel affect whether or not you approve it as a selection?
I wonder if they meant don't cover colonial issues? Yeah, they all do, right? So almost all of the novels on the list in some way or another are reflecting on post-colonial identity and culture and economies, and you know, even if it's more implicit than explicit. So for example, Carmen Buyosa's Before, right? The sort of effects of imperialism, in particular the Catholicism, right, on Mexican identity, is implicit in that novel, right? It's something that the character is trying to negotiate in whatever ways that she can, and some of the struggles and the effects of gender on her gender identity are implicit in that novel. But we tie, you know, then in our class discussion, we will tie those back to some of the concepts that came up in Jung's book, right? So it all ends up relating, right? And part of what we do is figure out, well, what are the, you know, what is this novel doing? Not just saying, but doing, right? As a post-colonial artifact, what's happening here? What is this author trying to convey? What forces is this author negotiating, and how is that related to, you know, the sort of post-colonial situation of this nation, right? And this history. And the context presentations help us with the history and all of that. So, right. So like how Catholicism was introduced to Mexico, and, you know, how that affected and in what ways it was intertwined with indigenous cultures, and the figure of the Virgen de Guadalupe and the cultural import of that figure, and how is this novel negotiating all that, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wonderful. We're running short on time. We've got about 2 minutes left, and I actually want to ask one last question, which is for any instructor hoping to implement this, what's been the hardest part about it for you? You've been doing this for many years. What's kind of the most challenging thing that an instructor can expect, and how have you kind of innovated to address that challenge?
I mean, the hardest part, right, was trying to figure out what structure was needed, like where I needed to provide structure, right? And so because I think it's because it's so different from what students are used to, right? That the structural components. So for example, having the whole calendar, like a blank calendar, you know, and coming into class with that calendar. I mean, I had to learn that the hard way, because the first semester I was being really flexible and I didn't have that. And then it became sort of, oh, we need to figure this out, you know, ex nihilo in this class period, and it didn't go as well, right? But when I came in with the blank calendar and then we started, you know, filling it in, it helped so much, right? Just having that simple structure there that we can then sort of populate as we see fit and move things around. And, you know, as we discuss, I'll just sit there on the classroom computer or in Zoom, you know, and just move things around. And so that's the challenge, is sort of like having enough structure so that people aren't panicking about this crazy chaotic thing, right? That they don't have a syllabus on the first day, right? We're deciding everything other than like the official college policies that I have to put on Canvas, right? Pretty much the whole class is getting designed, you know, with them in those first 2 weeks, and that's very different for students. I'm surprised at how little pushback I had on that. I actually expected more. And like I said, I've only done this now in this sort of radical way for 2 semesters. This is now, the spring was my 2nd semester teaching this course this way. And it's always surprising to me now after the 2nd time, how they just go along with it and feel pretty empowered. I mean, it's interesting when we lost so many students because of the COVID epidemic, right? Actually, in this class, I only lost 1 student. And I think that's telling, right? There's this buy-in, even when students couldn't access Zoom meetings, they would watch the recordings, they would send me feedback. I had one student who would take walks around his neighborhood on the cell phone so that he could be in on the Zoom meetings because he didn't have good Wi-Fi. You know, so there was this commitment and buy-in that happened. And I think they felt that right away from the beginning of the semester, that this was going to be totally different, but that they had a lot of choice. Yeah.
Certainly, and you use the word empowered or empowering. That's exactly what came to mind, and also to allow them to kind of take ownership. That always is going to lead to buy-in. We are over time, so I apologize, and we'll let everyone run. But thank you again, folks. Truly, thank you for engaging, for your wonderful questions. This is truly a tremendous topic and a technique that I hope some of you will start to integrate in the fall. Appreciative of all of you, especially appreciative of you, Cristina. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. We will see all of you folks perhaps at the happy hour, and if not, tomorrow morning.
Okay. And I just wanted to tell everybody if you have more questions and want to email me, you're perfectly welcome to. I'm just going to go ahead and write my email in the chat. So it's just dahlcr@butte.edu. So if you have any questions or just want to, bounce ideas back and forth, I would be very open to that. So thank you all, and thank you all for coming.
Thanks so much.
Bye.